Welcome to the For Madmen podcast. I am your host, Shane Hayes, and coming up on this week, we're discussing the documentary For Madmen Only, The Stories of Del Close, with the director, co-writer, Heather Ross, and its co-producer, editor, George Mandl. We're also joined by a frequent guest host, friend of the podcast, Dustin Levell, who I should mention when I'm recording this and posting this is the day before his birthday. So happy day before your birthday. He was also notorious for having 6 birthdays on Facebook at any given time. So this one's the real one. But first off, what I watched this week, I'm working right now, so I didn't really have anything interesting. A lot of into the night rewatches of whatever's available on Netflix and Amazon Prime. But one thing that stood out was I put on the 2010 Predators, produced by Robert Rodriguez, sequel to I don't know how many. If you don't count the Aliens versus Predator movies, is I guess the third Predator sequel, followed up by the Shane Black one. Which, if you don't count the Alien versus Predator movies, I'm actually a fan of all the Predator sequels for the most part. I mean, I don't really remember much about Predator 2, but the reboots, I'm surprised they did. And I remember this movie being kind of derided. And when I told friends I liked it, and I put it on, and it was still as good as I remembered. It's like a really crazy lean movie, and also just really throws you into the premise without knowing what the hell's going on in a very interesting way. And I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole and trying to remember what happened to its director, Nimrod Antal. He did, if you remember, his underrated 2007 movie Vacancy with Luke Wilson and Kate Beckinsale, which is solid. Um, Also, on a personal note, I don't remember if Predators was shot in Austin, but I was still working at the Austin Film Society as a projectionist off and on. And before they got ready to shoot, I don't know if they're in the middle of pre-production, I ran screenings for the production in Antal. They showed Fox sent in 2 prints. They sent in the original Predator and the McTiernan Predator, and then they sent, I believe it was Alien, not Aliens, Alien, if I remember correctly. And I didn't really get to talk to anybody in the production. I didn't have anything to do with it. It was an excuse to watch some really nice prints of both those movies. I remember him being kind of a filmmaker's filmmaker. Like he was good, and I mean, I've looked up some stuff. He's done some TV shows since then. He did a movie called The Whiskey Bandit in 2017, which now I kind of want to check out. And he worked on some M. Night Shyamalan TV shows. He did Wayward Pines and Servant. But I was always curious what happened to that guy. Also, on that nostalgia train, I watched Last Boy Scout on Netflix, which, speaking of Shane Black and Predator and Predators, obviously all that great Shane Black dialogue, but I don't need to litigate the whole history of the buddy cop and its iterations, but watching them right next to each other, Predators was a little better in this regard, but the two of them are just like, what is it with the like world weary antagonistic asshole as like the default character status of your protagonist, where it's just like, I'm just meeting you for the first time and I'm going to be a world weary asshole. Well, I'm just meeting you for the first time and I'm going to be a world weary asshole. We'll top that. Charming. It's still fun. It's a lot of the Shane Black archetypes were the divorced wife, the smart-ass kid. They're all there. Christmas in Last Boy Scout? I don't think it is. On a personal note for this week, also this weekend was super fun because we were brought back the Victory International Film Festival in Evansville, which if you're interested in more in that, you can check back on Matthew Olm's episode. Matt started the festival back in 2019, and then last year pandemic kind of wiped it out, and it was hampered a little in many ways, and it's kind of impressive that they were able to pull it off, but it was super fun. But at the end, on a personal note, they had an award ceremony, and they it's for those in Evansville, it's in that church that's in the old Hammerheads building on the second floor, and they try to set up like an Oscar ceremony, and they're giving all the awards to everybody, and the second to last award they give is a Spirit Award. And I don't remember the description of it, but it was something along the lines of who helped out the festival most. and two people won. I don't remember the first person. I was not familiar with the first person, but the second person to win was this podcast's own frequent co-host Ted Haycraft, and Ted could not have been more excited and touched to be able to give an Oscar speech. So he got up, he got very emotional, he dedicated it to his dad. It was one of my highlights of the week, and the festival was really fun and promising. I hope next year, once all the COVID issues get out of the way, which I mean we're going to be dealing with for years, it is very promising for the next few years. I'm very excited about that. But as for this episode, it's Heather Ross and George Mandl, who have worked a long time on the stories of Del Close, which you should see this documentary if you're not familiar with the name Del Close. And Dustin came on because he's an improv veteran of the Chicago scene and had worked with some of the institutions that Del was foundational on, including Improv Olympic. And this is a good episode. It is a really fascinating deep dive into not just the doc, but the subjects behind the doc and the nature of improv and creation. We end up talking a lot about this Chicago Improv Bible, Truth and Comedy, that's written by Close, Sharna Halpern, and Kim Johnson. We talk also a lot about the visual basis for the documentary is a comic book series called Wasteland, a pre-Vertigo DC series from the late 80s that is basically the one thing that Close put out to a biography. And again, if you're unfamiliar with Del Close, the term guru is used unironically, and there's a sequence in the documentary where you can find the roots of his teachings going to pretty much all of modern comedy, Saturday Night Live beyond. So there's just a lot in this episode. I hope you enjoy. What drew you guys to Del Close in the first place? Why, Heather? What is your background?
So I come from a doc background, and I was sort of working on a lot of like verite, hardcore, serious docs, and that's why I was in Chicago a while ago. I was working on a doc about teenage girls in prison
Okay,
who are
very
making
very
these.
improv comedy based.
Yeah, exactly. So I was there making this like serious doc, and like I was, sort of like, oh man, I better like really treat these kids with like kid gloves. And they were like, what? And they were just like so funny. They were like, they surprised me by being like hilarious and super smart in their humor and super dark in their humor, obviously, because they were going through some stuff. So like, yeah, it just started me thinking about what comedy is for, because like in my extracurricularly I was a big comedy nerd and going out to stand-up shows a lot.
That's
This
what
was like,
I was wanting to find out. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, improv was really not on my radar at that point. I was like you know here in LA going to like Largo and like sort of like low profile comedy, stand-up comedy.
Groundlings wouldn't have been a part of any of this or anything like that.
I knew about Groundlings. They like lived around the corner from it, but I never went because I just didn't totally know what it was. I knew, so we would go to these little like stand-up shows with like, like David Cross and, Paul F. Tompkins and like people like that. And I just loved it because it was like so self-referential and like kind of down and dirty, which are some of the things I ended up really loving about improv. So, I was in Chicago, like working on the serious doc with these hilarious girls, and sort of started wondering, yeah, what's the connection between humor and like the worst, crap that we go through, because that seems to be like the funniest stuff to me. So, around that time I was hearing about this like mysterious Del Close guy who like had a needle hanging out of his arm, but he trained all of my favorite, SNL comics. And, I was like, that guy probably knows something about darkness and comedy. I'm gonna check into him.
Okay. No, I mean it makes sense. Yeah, I hate to say it, but when I was in LA, I never did growlings either, but I was at Largo shows too. But George, did you were was were you, did you have any improv interests, or did you have experience with it, or?
Not really as heavily as Heather. She kind of brought me into this world. But I mean,
Sorry.
I do love it, and you know, I've I've worked on. I mean, I used to work on this show, The League, and there was a ton of improv on that show.
There's
And
a lot of Chicago improv people, isn't there?
yep,
Okay,
and it's based in Chicago. I mean, the show takes place in Chicago. I
okay.
mean, it's not filmed there, but uh, uh, there was a lot of improv in that, and it turned out some of the cast of that show, you know, came from some of the same DNA. You know, Paul Scheer, you know, is a big UCB guy. He's
Jason
sort of Nick Kroll.
Mantzoukas.
You know, they all kind of live in that space.
Yeah.
People's faces that were in the doc too.
Well, let's see who was Jason.
Yeah.
Jason was Paul's voice was. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah,
think that also was super interesting, like how, yeah, how that like comedy DNA flows. Like, because, you know, my entry point into Del Close was like Gilda Radner and Bill Murray, sort of his OG, some of his OG students. But then the more you dig, the more you find out, like, you know, Tina Fey and Amy Poehler are part of that. And then it's the people that, like, you know, Amy Poehler and Matt Walsh and the UCB4 trained. And, you know, another offshoot is like all the writers on Conan. And, you know, we didn't really
yeah.
get into that, but like The Office comes out of like, was heavily influenced by Del Close, and everybody had to read Truth and Comedy. And, you know, just all these things that I didn't have any idea were related, but that I liked, all had this sort of like weird, you know, creepy grandfather, Del Close. So we had to like
You guys
do a
have that
quiz
great
about.
TV montage in there where everything comes off the TV and just all the people that Dell would have influenced. Dustin, what is you know, you and I started did Second City real briefly before you continued on to it, but you eventually moved on to Improv Olympic, didn't you?
Yeah, I started at Second City actually in 2001, so it was right after Dell had died. And then I was doing like I was still living back in Indiana and driving up to Chicago. So I did like summer things, and then I did the improv festival for a few years, and then I moved to Chicago and went through Second City, and then IO and Annoyance as well. Yeah,
Oh, the Holy Trinity.
yeah,
What was your
the
IO experience like then?
Um, so it was I took from Sharna actually at IO and she is the for people that don't know so it was actually Improv Olympic I think when I was there and she started it with Dell, and she really used a lot of Dell's teaching to kind of build the theater. Um, but she was not necessarily known as an improviser or as a teacher unto herself. She's known more as the businesswoman and like the kind of the face of IO. It was always,
Okay.
you know, she was always walking around with her dogs and stuff like that. So, so a lot of her class was just her telling stories about Chris Farley getting on stage and things like that.
Oh my
But I
God.
took a lot of, yeah, I took with a lot of other people that were in the documentary. So, Susan Messing and you know
She's
Dave
great.
Pasquazi and all those people. Yeah. So.
Was how much if you were it was like what 2 years you got to Chicago or started doing improv in Chicago after Dell died? How much was Dell still talked about then? I mean, besides beyond the teaching, but just more of like his legacy still being all around.
You know, it's interesting how much it has changed over the years. So when I showed up in whatever it was 2001, he was still very much like there was a hole that had like you know from him leaving, and I you really talk about this really well in your documentary that he had become the guru, and at a certain point it was like a little bit of a self-professed title, but also he really was. There was kind of this idea that everybody had to go through and you had to take a class with Dell, you know, and by that point, honestly, in his teaching, he wasn't teaching as much, and you know, right before he died, and so there was not a lot of like you know people. Those students were not as popular or like big on him, but at that point, they were already taking classes with his students, like his you know the people that he trained, the next generation that had come along. Um, and then when he died, there was still this thing like, oh my God, Dell's gone, and like you would still get in class, these teachers would say, oh, like they would impart to you what Dell's wisdom was. But there was still this huge thing. So at the IO Theater, which was at the time back on Clark Street, kind of like a half mile from where I live now, he had his own theater. So there was like the main cabaret theater, and then there was an upstairs theater, and he died of emphysema, and so like late in his life he couldn't even go upstairs to his own theater, but there was like he was very into you guys show in the movie the pagan rituals and the stuff that he does, but he had like a little like I don't know what you'd call like a implement, like some sort of little temple thing, and then like you could leave cigarettes in like in a glass jar for him. So there was this huge like spirit, like like, oh my God, Dell's there. And then there were other people that immediately wanted to either become the guru, or they were saying this person is now the guru, like, and so like somebody else wanted to like and some people,
curious who that was.
well, so I mean, I don't, Dell was definitely the guru, and he like wanted that title, and it was very important to him. After he passed away, Mick Napier kind of became like the guy that people wanted to go to, and Mick has his own book, and he's briefly in your movie too. But Mick also is sort of a different sort of person, and didn't necessarily like want to be like in that sort of way. I mean, a great teacher,
not a cult leader.
Not a cult leader, but like a great guy to like take classes from and stuff like that. But like other people wanted to be the guru. One person called himself the impresario. Like it was weird. Like people wanted to have the titles and things.
No.
And then a few years later, when I was actually like going through Second City, I remember going into a class that Michael Gelman was teaching, and he was like, I forgot that I have to do this Dell Close like thing. It was like a 5-year retrospective of like after Dell had passed away. So we go, and there's on stage Gelman and Dave Pasquazi and some other people that knew Dell, Tim Kazurinsky and things. And they were not as positive. It was like some of the shine had started to come off of him, because one thing you really show in this movie as well is, and you point out, is that he had a lot of mental, issues, and he had a lot of addictions. And quite frankly, he was just an asshole. Like, and I don't know, in the world today, like he had some very different ideas about women's role in comedy in terms of like, he had like a Jerry Lewis kind of idea of how women were funny. He's a little homophobic. I had never read his comic book, and I really want to talk to you about that. But like, I thought that was interesting.
I read 6 issues of it last night, which I'll get into later.
Yeah, but I thought that was interesting, like the Bernie Sahlins, like a little bit of anti-Semitism in there, like. So the stories start coming out that he's not very much a positive person, and then also in improv, it's so ephemeral. Like it's very hard to capture on film and like really like translate what it's like to be in the room when it's happening. So at this point, Dell has passed away and been gone for several years, and now the people that he taught are in a lot of ways like moving on. They've all gone on to Saturday Night Live or The Daily Show or wherever they were, right?
Right.
And so you now have the next generation from them that are the teachers, and so you're kind of more removed from that main source. So he kind of became a figure sort of outside, and there was also not there wasn't the big rivalry between like Second City and IO anymore. So it was like you kind of like, they were both kind of their own thing. So like Dell and Bernie, and you show that great in the movie as well. Like that was a big thing in the 80s, and it was really important to them, like this artistic vision about, is improv an art unto itself, or is it just a tool to make comedy? And it got to a point like for the students that you don't care. Like you want to go and you want to take from specific people. So
well, I mean, for the doc, you guys, I mean, what was the templates that you tried to keep it simple to? Like, it was just Dell and use that as to talk about Dell's influence. Like, you didn't want to necessarily go into a full thing on Chicago's improv scene in itself, although you had to naturally, just because the influence of comedy coming from it, or going to Toronto later with Second City.
Yeah, it's definitely not like a history of improv. Like we don't talk about like Viola Spolin or Paul Sills or like people who came before Dell. One thing I know working in media is like it's the easy thing that ends up being what everybody knows. So a lot of people think like, oh, Dell invented improv or whatever. It just becomes like the easy way to say it. He definitely didn't. And there were definitely a million other players before him and during him and adding to him. But I was interested in him as like a character, like
Right.
less of an exploration. I mean, it is sort of a biography of an art form as well, but it's like sort of how that emerged from him. And, by looking at him as one of the primary sources or rivers of this art form, you start to see how art develops in general and how it's like sort of like a big ecosystem of people, a lot of whom never get any credit, but it's, it is, it's all one sort of like muddy, sludgy, disgusting world. But then like, a few people kind of poke their heads out and get famous or notorious in
I think,
case.
well, one thing I really like, and maybe this is because I just read this book recently, but I read this biography about Leo Fender and Les Paul, and like kind of it's not a history of the guitar, but these are two people that designed the guitar, right? Like, people know Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix and, Jimmy Page, and like they, all the guitar gods, but people don't necessarily know the people that made the guitar. And I thought there was sort of, Les Paul was not, as a madman as much as Del Close was, but it was the same sort of thing where he was very much, he did not invent the electric guitar or the solid body electric guitar, but he pushed these innovations in a way that when no one else cared. And so Del Close did not create long form improv or any, improv, but he's the reason why people do improv the way they do today, because he cared about it so much when no one else wanted to sell it. So he pushed,
and we're actively pushing him against it too, it felt like.
Exactly, yeah.
I actually kind of skimmed through Truth and Comedy for the first time last night, and I was kind of found interesting, especially at the beginning, his dedications were to old Compass people, and a lot of them, you mentioned, Heather, all these people in key and improv who never heard of, or just remembered, or just their career didn't like, you think of Dell and Mike Nichols fighting, but like there was more people. But in the dedications, I mean, like you have that part in the doc where he says he's still in love with Elaine May to a certain extent. Elaine May's thing, Theodore J. Flicker, and Severin Darden. And I was going through their lists of stuff, and like there was a lot of cool stuff in the '60s, but there was also a cool list of other stuff. Like, have any of you guys seen The President's Analyst?
No, but it's that's one
they
of
were
the
both they both
committee.
overlapped on it too, and it's always been a recommendation to watch. But like just stuff like that, or like did a movie that Buck Henry wrote called The Troublemaker.
Yeah, I mean Flickr was super interesting, and like it was kind of cool. It was like an age of like all these like sort of bohemian, edgy people, and you could like they were out of St. Louis and then going to New York, and like.
Yeah.
And then, it's just as, they were experimenters, and yeah, probably, it's kind of like the underground comics or the edgy comics of our age that maybe nobody will remember, but definitely, got some stuff going.
And a documentary like this is naturally going to be about myth making and legend making, and Dell seems pretty prone to self mythologizing. But you said comics, but my brain went to a different part. We should talk about the comic. How was it? It's a really interesting choice to use that as like, but it's to template it for the doc. But like, did you do it just because of the visuals there, or like because he says that there's some biography in there, and there is, but I mean, I don't like. There's 18 issues. I checked with my local comic book store. My frequent co-host Ted Haycraft was ordering for that store, and he told me, yeah, we might still have some. I called. They have all 18 issues because they over-ordered in the 80s. It's a really weird particular time for comics too, because it's like you guys mentioned it's post Watchmen and Dark Knight, but it's also like. Is that like post Alan Moore Swamp Thing, pre Vertigo? I think most people will be familiar with it with Sandman. It's a very DC horror stuff, and it's very distinctive. And for Del Close, like that being the key thing, he's besides Truth and Comedy, which he's one of 3 authors on. to have an 18-issue Vertigo horror comic from the late 80s that has this kind of like not EC but kind of an EC vibe to it. It's how did
It's
you guys
crazy.
how did you guys do this? Like, were you just cherry picking it for the autobiographical stuff, or and was it the first your first instinct to do this just because it's visual, or?
It came, no, it wasn't the first instinct. It was like, it kind of came out of like, look, we have this guy, we're telling the story of this guy. But it's not that he wasn't a famous guy, you know, like he was in some weird movies. So we're going to use those, you know, and we're going to like scour Chicago for all the tapes and, you know, things in people's basements. But like, it's still not enough to like really, you know, show it. We still need more material. So like when we found out about the Wasteland, I was kind of like, oh yeah, that's fucking weird. Oh, sorry.
No, cuss all way. You can fucking cuss all you want. That's good.
Awesome. Fuck yeah. So we, yeah. So, but my writing partner was like, this could be really cool. This is like very like something I didn't know about, and I was a comics fan in the 80s, and you know when we started looking at it. Yeah, it's not strictly autobiographical, but there are, you know, in every issue, there's usually like one or two stories from Dell's life, and they're fully souped up and like, you know, they enter fantasy land for sure. And I thought, well, that's like really revealing, you know, like if he's going to portray,
it is revealing.
himself,
it's definitely revealing. Yeah.
Yeah, and like, you know, like it's like this is how the story existed in his fevered brain, you know, like with aliens or, you know, weird swamp creatures or whatever. And then like George was even like poking around in some of the other stories, and like, you know, you had a question about that, like, you know, there's a story about like abortion and how you should be able to abort like kids up to age 18 or something.
Well, we mentioned
right.
Mentioned that in the scene. The title of it is retroactive abortion.
Yeah.
RAB. And they like, I think the visuals are like, you know, they are like throwing a baby out a window. You know?
I think that's how it ends, isn't it?
And it's like you should be able to abort. I think it's up to age 12. You should be able to still abort your child.
Yeah.
The craziest story I noted down was the story about the kid who thinks his stepdad's a werewolf. That was probably one of the best ones I read.
That's a good one. And there's another one. I mean, yeah, and that's what I was going to say is like they're like George was like cluing into the fact that there are these stories that are not autobiographical, but kind of speak to Dell's weird father son, you know, suicidal urges. Like, you know, there's another one where it's like a son is like has to dissect a frog at school, and like he comes home all upset, and so he and the dad go and they dissect the biology teacher.
I did not read that one. I didn't read that one.
Yeah, good. But no, that was one of the ones they were like most proud of, him and John. And you definitely can see something very personal in there, you know, with his weird relationship with his dad. And
the whole thing is so fascinating because he didn't write a normal autobiography. He gave us this. And
it's such a weird legacy to leave too, or a place to put it in autobiography.
But it's so him because he was such a, you know,
that's a good point.
He was such a, you know, he was not one to tell you things as they are. He was one to like sort of bury the truth in whatever mechanisms he felt like at the time. And it was, you know, and this is what he was doing then.
Well, I have a question for all of you because being not as familiar with Dell as you guys, in the doc, whenever you first talk about Dell Close's father committing suicide in front of him, I noted down right away that sounds like bullshit. Specifically because the glass, he was like, he drank a glass of water and then, you know, flailed as he died, and turned out it was all battery acid. I immediately went to like, how does one get battery acid out of a battery? Do you like, and then do you get multiple batteries until you get a full glass of it? And then when you drink it down, do you just calmly like shake your arm as you die and the acid burns in your throat? And I think elsewhere you mentioned sulfuric acid. And then you also mentioned towards the end that there's this controversy over whether this happened exactly, but Dell's telling us what is how do people typically view this? The biographers view this, like, do they take it? Is it a questionable, controversial thing, or?
Well, the Howard Johnson, who is in the movie and is sort of like Dell's maybe most truthy biographer, did like research all of these myths, and some of them he discerned were true and some weren't. And so he found the death certificate. He found the stories in the paper, and it was, Dell was not 8 or 9, like he said. He was 21. He wasn't living in Kansas even. So he was in New York. So it certainly didn't happen the way he said it did.
Okay.
So that's like an interesting thing, because that's like a full Wasteland story. That could have been a Wasteland story. And that's,
or as he says, a story to get laid.
Or a story to get laid, or a story to get attention, or a story that like, wow, this was like so painful to me, and if I just tell it like it happened, no one's going to get that, so I'm going to really put a lot of bells and whistles on it until somebody sees how horrifying this was. Like, we don't know. It might have been all of those things. I think there are probably parts of Dell that were mysterious even to himself.
Emotional truth,
right?
I think that also kind of speaks to like how he perceived himself, and that's one of the things that I really enjoyed was in this show was that like there was so much of him like trying to find his identity. So he starts out as like a carnival part, or in the circus freak, right? And then he's fire eater and things, and then he kind of moves into theater. And when he went to San Francisco and worked with the committee, and he invents the Herald, he actually hates the name the Herald, and he kind of like fought against it for a long time from what I read. And then like later in life, he kind of like owned it like it was his thing, and like kind of retroactively changed the history that, that it was his idea to call it the Herald or something like that. But a lot of people remember it that it was from a different way. So I always thought that was interesting.
What was the Herald like before it became the Teaching Herald? There was more rules onto it.
It didn't really have rules. It was like a demolition derby on stage. Like there was nothing. And we had this great interview with Adam McKay, and he talks a lot about this. And obviously we used some of it, and there's a ton of it that we didn't use. But one of the analogies he gives is that it's the Teaching Herald was like basketball, right? Like didn't you say that it was like a
fast break?
Yeah, and it was like how do you do a like imagine basketball players on the court with no lanes. So imagine if they didn't have their lanes and they didn't know what to do, and they their passing wasn't figured out, and dribbling wasn't totally figured out either, and the hoop was always changing height.
So like the format like there was no format really. He was just trying to figure things out, and it was all long form. And you have to realize that even to those old people like Paul Sills and like the other Compass players, what they thought of as improv was so incredibly short. Like I remember doing it was like the 50-year anniversary of the Compass players, whatever, and I'm like interning backstage, and somebody's on stage like doing scenes for them, like hey, look, this is this art form that you created. And they were backstage bitching because they're like, why are they doing this so long? Like it's just such short little scenes. And then Dell was trying to push things for like, an hour long, 2 hours long. And it just was never working, like in terms of success rate. Like even your best improvisers are going to hit maybe 80% of the time, your Tina Feys or, TJ Jagodowski's or whoever. Those are, hopefully they get something interesting, but it's probably not going to be funny for very much of the time. And so one of the things that was actually interesting was before Dell came along, Sharna was working with a guy named David Shepard. I don't know if you guys study him much, right? He had the original kind of workings for the Improv Olympic, where they were going to bring in part of the problem with improv is in the history of improv is that it's always straight white guys with ties, right? That's kind of the long
or from
legacy.
Schomburg, as you guys mentioned.
White guys in khakis.
Right, and like, that's I mean, we learned that at Second City. Like you have to do find out how to make your scene for Ma and Pa Schomburg. But yeah, or the guys in khakis, or like the way that Tina Fey described it in the being like pulled in the cult. But it's
is that why you have to be able to appeal to like middle Schomburg people? That's the point of why everyone was dressed like that.
I mean, that's so there's a push and pull, with Second City, like how edgy, and then but ultimately like who's coming in? It's the tourists coming from Middle America, or you're in a bus going to Middle America, or later on they're on a cruise line or something like that. So
was there a tension between the touring company and the home company on this too?
Oh, absolutely. Amy Poehler was famous because the touring company would go out for Second City, and you had to do like a best of show. And Amy Poehler's touring company would go out and just do their own material. Like they weren't actually, because they're like, oh, no one's watching us. Like, no one knows what we're doing. So we'll just whatever we want. So they got in trouble for it.
That's great.
But anyway, back to David Shepard. When the Improv Olympics started, he was a compass player and one of the early people with Paul Sills, and really pushed this Bertolt Brecht kind of, and also socialist idea to the theater. And he had this idea for Improv Olympic where it was going to be like, we'll get a team of rabbis to do improv, and a team of plumbers, and a team of like just different like factions that you wouldn't normally see. And it failed miserably. Like you just can't get those are the people that want to come do it. I know, it sounds like a great idea. And so like it kind of fell apart, and that's when Sharna went looking for someone new. And Del, like you say in your show, your movie, was that he was looking for kind of a place. And I love that Adam McKay bit calling it the Teaching Herald, because I'm like, yes, this is exactly what it ends up becoming.
Right.
Like it becomes a very good structured format that you learn. And then from that, they create other, improvised forms like the Bat or the, the musical or different sorts of things. Yeah.
I mean, it was like his white whale since the time in San Francisco. And that, I don't remember what year it was. It was in the 60s, the Summer of Love in San Francisco. He like accidentally found the Herald in like a, heroin induced, haze, and then decided to chase it for the rest of his life. And eventually he got it,
Well, I mentioned I read Truth in Comedy for the first time, or just skimmed through it yesterday, but I wrote down a bunch of stuff in here that for someone that, this doc is based on someone who has a dark impulse to create art, and obviously this book was authored by 3 people. There's a lot of fucking wisdom in this, and a lot of wisdom that doesn't just apply to storytelling, but like living a mentally healthy life. There was support and trust is obviously a big part. Make connections, don't force them. Don't try to make jokes. Respect choices by others. There's no mistakes. Everything is justified. The best way to look good is to make your fellow players look good. Accept and build. Stay in the moment. Now is the key to discovery. No such thing as a mistake. And then in storytelling, or like if you're just trying to like draft, get a story out of you, keep it simple. Less is more. Start a scene in the middle. Active choices. Be specific. Avoid generalities and reveal through character. I mean, for someone that's fucked up on drugs a lot of the time, like I could see why this book is so influential and is taught to other people.
Yeah, and I think it's like you said, it was a revelation to me to read, because I came from a really different way of understanding creativity and understanding making, as a filmmaker, you do this, and there's auteur theory and stuff. And, to have something that was so collaborative and so like, you can't be wrong, like this is all just coming out of our own stories, our own experience, our own honesty. So like, your job is to justify and find out why you made that weird connection that seems like a mistake, but it's not. So to me, it was really helpful. And in writing, I find it really helpful too. And, that to me was like, that's something that's really special about this art form, whether or not you enjoy a half-hour Herald on your local, and some do more than others. Like the fact that it gives permission for people to, to put themselves into something, and like makes art making accessible to anybody who gets that book at the library, that's pretty great.
Right.
I got a lot out of making this film too. Just I sort of feel like, having seen all this footage and hearing all these people who worked with Del talk about him so intimately, and his teachings and his persona, I feel a little bit like I've taken at least one class from him. You know, like there's we just had to get to know all this stuff so well, and you can't help but absorb it. And it definitely have taken some of these lessons, like things that you just mentioned, and brought them into like my editing work.
Well, as an editor, like when I first getting into movies, the auteur theory was so nice sounding until you have to become a collaborator, and then you're just like, I need someone that needs to learn how to collaborate better, or just
Yeah.
like,
And it's BS. I mean, if anyone who's ever made a film like knows it's not one person's vision.
yeah, or just like I get the power structure that like there needs to be a head for
Mhm.
business and all that stuff, kind of, but at the same time, like these are great rules for collaboration and actual
Yeah.
like because so much collaboration people are taught bad collaboration is to not encourage in so many ways, like, or to have a fault or a elusive idea of what success is. Like, we just need to make something good, and if you collaborate, it's like, I got a specific task, let's get together and make something that, like, and I mean these rules when creation is so nebulous, and especially on the spot, and as you mentioned, Dustin, it's ephemeral. Like in improv, these are good guideposts. This book and a lot of what I guess Dell's teaching was, which again, it's so weird just because like he just seems very mentally unhealthy, as presented in the movie.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and that's interesting because I found that irony like totally interesting too. Some people said maybe like the stage, that he maybe at heart he was an idealist and the stage was where those ideas could live. And he didn't really know how to make them live outside of it. He was too defensive and he was too, you know, you mentioned a lot of things that we of course don't like about him, that he, said a lot of sexist things and, you know, uh, he was like, a shock guy. He loved to shock. That's
Yeah,
not my
right.
favorite
That does
fucking
seem to
part of
come clear.
anybody, and it's not very authentic either, if you're just saying things to get a rise out of people. So it's interesting. It makes me wonder if he was chasing that or if he just knew he was too broken to have these qualities, but let's put him on a place where we, he was like creating like a little safe place where nobody could, come at you. Nobody could criticize. Everybody's supporting each other. Everybody's, I feel like that was probably something he needed and was looking for.
It makes sense just because like early heralds you guys are describing, there's something that sounds so masochistic about it, and like I mean, in the book, quotes John Belushi saying good improv is better than sex, but at the
Mhm.
same time, I'm sure we and people listening have seen. I don't know whether a good Dustin, what you said, 80%. I thought it would be higher, of like bad improv, like the level of like,
Yeah.
because bad improv is so hard to watch just because it's just people trying to like, and you're it's like I'm paying to go to an art gallery of my friend's 4-year-old drawings. Like, just like, I want to support this. I want to support this,
Yeah.
but this is interminable.
Well, I mean, it goes back to kind of with his teaching and the thoughts and things that any way that you learn improv, and the Truth in Comedy was kind of like the first Bible. Like, it was the first one. Like, I mean, Viola Spolin had like her little games book, but like that was the first real book that wrote down, like you said, Heather, for the chance for like people in Middle America to like learn how to do improv that had never seen it or had a chance to like take classes at a Second City or an Improv Olympic. And the basic idea is, when you go on stage and you don't have a script and you're going to do something, your first impulse is to be scared, and so you kind of get in yourself, you start saying no and negating, and you don't want to play along. And so much of Dell's teaching, I mean, he didn't come up with the yes and idea, but he said it in a new way, and Mick says it in a different way, and everybody kind of says the same idea of just trying to push yourself out there in a way that you're fearless. And I that's what you keep hearing from the people in your documentary, Chris Farley or Bob Odenkirk, and
I love the Elaine May quote about yes and being invented because she wanted to figure out a way to get out on stage and survive, but get out of the stage of life. But as you've mentioned, Dustin, that seems like a very fear-based way of creating yes and.
Yeah, I mean that's it's not always people just saying no, but they're not going along with your scene partner in a scene, and so the only way you'll find something interesting is by pushing and elevating further, by complimenting and agreeing with your scene partner or going along with their idea, or and this is true for basically. I think this is kind of another way where it can go out into other arts. Like the idea of collaboration is if you're willing to be open and listen to your collaborators on the project and take it to the next level in a way that you guys are working together as a team. It's not just that's where improv is different from a stand-up, where they're just trying to control the room with it's their jokes and like they need to have that power. There's a huge vulnerability in improv, not that there isn't in stand-up, but in a way that you're just out there, you don't have any jokes that are going to get laughs to hide behind. You're just out there trying to make something interesting. And as being someone that has been on stage doing that cringeworthy improv, and then also being on stage and getting like that, that high and that getting the laughs, it's both amazing and terrifying. And it's not something that's easy to recreate every time, but when it works, like, you're doing what he says. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like watching the creative process happen in front of you, because that's whether you're an editor or a writer or whatever, like that it's sort of equal parts like, oh my God, I'm an idiot, why did I think I could do this, and like, oh my God, I'm a genius, this is amazing, like I've cracked the code. So and you see that in improv, like every time you can see a bunch of crappy shows where connections aren't being made, and then you see one where it all comes together and it's so funny, and you're like, it's more satisfying in a way than like great stand-up, because you watched it happen and you felt like maybe you were like a little bit of a part of that, and like as an audience you're looking for those connections too, and you're like along for the ride. So it's less passive, it's like you're an active watcher.
It's always a very you had to be there kind of moment. Totally. So like, I mean, if you think about the funniest things that happened in your life, you're probably not going to think about like a John Mulaney bit, like, which are probably hilarious, but the funniest things are you and your friends joking around. And when you're in an improv show, either in the audience or on stage, and you see like that look, and that that actor, that improviser is having the same realization that their character, and you're in the audience and you're seeing that for the first time that they are, it's just amazing. Like, because you all of a sudden get that subtext and all this, all the beautiful things that you'd want to see in a movie or a play. And it's being, like you said, created right there in front of you, and you're seeing it for the first time that the actor is seeing.
Yeah. I've been preoccupied with rewriting lately, as like rewriting is the thing that makes good writers writers. And you always frame it in a way of like, who would put out their first draft right away, and improv is that. And it also, but at the same time, everyone has to vomit out a first draft, and there are those rare times in writing when you nail it, which is with that small percentage in improv, it feels like.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm doing more writing myself, and I actually feel a little differently. I feel like often the first draft has something, you can stumble on something that's really honest, and you want to polish it, you want to find out, you want to like push it, but like I find that like it's sort of diminishing returns if I'm coming at it like over and over and over again. I don't know, I guess everyone's different.
I was gonna say, George, I got that from editing. Like I just started finding like re-editing is your assemblies are interminable too.
They can be, yeah. And particularly editing improvised comedy stuff, you have those moments of discovery on set like you would the first time on a stage. But then the difference is they go back and they shoot it 5 more times. They're like, oh, that's a great joke. Let's try that from these 7 angles. By the time you get to that perfect take where the audio is clean and everything's like as you want it, it's not funny anymore because it doesn't feel real. It's like this.
Yeah.
It's like it's become like a scripted line, and it no longer has that same sort of like initial bang. So like on the League, I remember a lot of times I would end up using like the first or maybe the second strike of a joke, because that's the one that felt like, oh, this feels like a person talking. This does not feel like an actor saying a line.
Or the sense of discovery.
Yeah, and sometimes they wanted that, and sometimes they're like, we want to, it's not as clean. Let's get the clean one, and that's one of the reasons why that show ended up feeling like people. I would talk to people, and they go, "Oh, that was improvised. I thought that was a scripted show." For people who didn't.
Speaking of all the people that were in the League, like the other interesting thing with the doc was the film segments. How did that come about? I mean, was it just when I brought up the comic earlier, you also had the really cool bounty of the taped recordings of.
Yes.
Did Del Close record himself a lot?
People recorded him, and and not very well. Like it's like you can tell it's like someone's like weird reel to reel that they plunked down in the middle of the room, and but it was really cool to find those have been sitting in someone's garage for years, and it was like the Del that you always hear about but don't have any footage of, like the Del who's like totally waxing philosophical or yelling at his students, all these things that like, us who came after like only hear the stories. So it was like, it's real, so that was
But
fun.
it sounds like it'd also be a bunch of room tone if it's badly recorded. So to do
garbage.
the recreations.
Well, the recreations were Heather and her co-writer Adam Samuel Goldman, we call him ASG. They came up with this idea based on two things. One, kind of like what we touched on before, there just is not a lot of footage of Del Close out there. So you're making a documentary; it's a visual medium. You need to see something. Okay. Otherwise you just have a bunch of talking heads, and it's like that. And we didn't want to do that, and so it just kind of evolved from regular documentary. Then Wasteland was discovered, and that became like a mechanism for telling the story of Del Close's life, and then this sort of just like kind of grew out of that. The idea that let's have these scenes that tell us something about the process of putting this comic together. And so that's where it grew from. And the idea behind those was that everything Del Close says is a thing that he actually said. So those are like real lines of dialogue. There is probably some, it's not like he said everything exactly like that in that order.
I was curious about how the DC Comics, when they called into the DC Comics headquarters conversation, how that was reassembled.
That was
those were all, well, the Del lines were all just batshit stuff he said at different places about like amoebas and let's do a scene inside a laundry machine, and
right.
And then Lennon, Parham, and Lauren Lapkus are such great improvisers, and that was the idea. It was like Del's going to be locked. James Urbaniak is going to have his lines that like are religious to what Del actually said, but then everyone else can do whatever they want. And like Lauren and Lennon went crazy and just like fully improvised their lines.
Talking about like Fatal Attraction and stuff. Like
it was great.
The Fatal Attraction joke that got me pretty. Yeah.
There's a bunch of stuff. I mean, that they gave us so much stuff. We just sort of like used what we liked the best.
That was our like Bechdel scene, test scene, where I was like, I can't have a movie that doesn't pass the Bechdel test. Let's put some ladies in there and just have them.
You got it into a Del Close movie too.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they're both,
they're amazing
disciples of all that stuff.
I don't know. I wouldn't call them disciples. I don't know if they were UCB people who are heavy improv people.
I guess that's what I mean.
Okay. but we don't know how they felt about
They
the
do not.
man.
They do not have altars to Del Close in their house.
Okay.
To be clear.
No. I mentioned my freaking co-host Ted. He thought he knew John Ostrander at this time because he was going to the Chicago Con, and he told me about the book, Wasteland, but like he doesn't really know much about improv comedy, and so I feel like he knew Del Close, he knew who Del Close was, but when he was talking about this and being in those circles, he was saying like, I think I might have met Del Close, but I don't remember it. That seemed to me as
interesting.
emblematic of a Del Close thing where it was just like, yeah, he's a guru, but do you remember him in a movie? Not really. Do you know what he looks like? Not really.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, for the longest time, nobody, I mean, like, I cared because I remember the old Upright Citizens Brigade TV show, and I was like, that's Del Close's voice at the beginning, like, doing the thing, like, and that was the only time I ever would get to, like, hear Del Close, and, like, you guys, I learned of him, and, like, everybody was talking about this person. Bill Murray wants to make a movie about him. Harold Ramis wants to make a movie, like, like, there's all this, like, this guy is so important, but you never really got to see him other than the picture. Then you have the Truth in Comedy book, which he didn't really like. I mean, he's an author on it, but I don't think he did any of the actual writing. I think they took his words. If I remember the stories correctly, Howard Johnson and Charna Halpern like wrote that book for him from his ideas and things. And but you don't have again, there was nothing on like camera or anything because people didn't. Outside of the small group of people that like trained with him, no one else cared. So you would have to take that trip to Chicago to like actually train with Del or train with the people that trained with Del or like these other improvisers.
Yeah, that's what Matt Walsh said. Was he was like sort of like Mr. Miyagi. You had to go to the source to like find, especially then. Now you have so many schools and it's a thing, but like at that point, you really had to travel to Chicago and go to like the Oracle, who could tell you about it, who was the only one who was really like making it his thing to know about it and had worked with it, over the years.
Well, speaking of being on camera, was there anything more to his last big encounter, the day where everyone came to visit him when he was, was there anything more to it than what was presented in the documentary? Because it seems, for someone that's not on camera much, to like film what's supposed to be ostensibly your last day of living, like very theatrical.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, he was, he liked to make a splash. I mean, yeah, from what I've heard of people who were there, that he was just spectacular that day, even though he was, at that point, couldn't breathe very well and was probably in a lot of pain. He was like genial and he said hello to everyone, and he was funny and he gave Sharna her due, and he he like made the rounds like the guru he was, and then from the people I talked to who saw him the next day, he was like completely kind of a shell, like, it was, night and day. And he, I think he did pass away the next day. Wow. And there's a funny story where he sort of decided, or it seems like he decided that his last words should be, "I'm tired of being the funniest one in the room." But he, so he said that and probably got a big laugh from the few people that were in there.
What's the Oscar Wilde supposedly last line?
Oh yeah, either the drapes go or I do.
Kids in the Hall had that sketch where they had that in there. That's the only reason I remember it.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, so he says this line and then he doesn't die. And like
hours later.
Well, no, it wasn't hours later. It was like a totally like a bit gone wrong. So like, it was like,
improv.
He's like, oh no, like, and like his last words were actually him like yelling at, I think, like Howard Johnson for fixing his pillow wrong or something.
It's a herald that just keeps going.
Yeah.
It was very, he also had like, because it was all very theatrical, as I understand it, like that he wanted to make it a big presentation, and he gave kind of this like speech where he was like, there's this, I want to quote like a woman from another land that is misunderstood, and he says this beautiful thing about like what life is and what death is. And he goes, Leni Riefenstahl.
Oh, right,
so
yeah.
the Nazi filmmaker.
He likes to shock people.
Yeah, like just to throw that in. And then I don't think you had this in the movie, but there was always this legend too that about his skull after he died, that he wanted like to have his skull bequeathed to the Goodman Theater because
that's in there.
You have this thing where like
I was gonna say I think that was in the movie. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
it's in the end credit. It's like in the credit roll.
Oh, right.
A little picture in picture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that he like they would never let him on the stage, and so he wanted to play Horatio as the skull in Hamlet. Yeah.
Were you around in Chicago for that, Dustin? Like when that was all going down? Were you?
Mm-hmm.
Did you?
Yeah.
You remember that being presented to the Goodman Theater and?
Yeah. It was like a thing, and everybody was like, "This is a little weird," or like, "This is like," but like it was a very Dell thing, so
yes.
like we 100% like believed that he did it, but like we were like, is everybody going along with this or whatever? And then like years later, it came out that it wasn't really his skull; it was just a skull. But
Sharna was mad. Sharna was mad about it. She said, I think she called him a jerky reporter.
Some jerky reporter
was sniffing around, or
yeah. So
yeah, but I think they said that they like even like used to pass the skull around, like when they were writing Elf, maybe Jon Favreau like had it sent to like the writer's room or the set or something.
Sounds right.
Yeah.
That's fucking crazy.
What was that after knowing that it was not his skull?
I don't know who knew and who didn't.
I think there's something kind of even touching about passing around after you know it wasn't his skull.
Exactly. No,
the novelty works.
Yeah, part of the myth.
I thought the other touching thing that was a really key thing to focus on towards the end of the doc was the curse of gurus of, your students are going to surpass you, and his ambivalence about that.
Yeah, and it like that was another thing I found really touching about his story and relatable, that like we don't always end up being the thing we thought we would. Like I think, there was a part of Dell that thought he would be the leading man, who thought he would be the star, and that wasn't him. That was never, ever, ever from the get-go who he was. He was always an oddball. He was always like a provocateur. Like those people are not the guys and girls that get to be on center stage. They're the ones that like shake it up and challenge us, so it was interesting, and I had heard about that video before we ended up actually seeing it. But so, I was told a couple times, like, I don't know how much Dell accepted himself in his role of a teacher, but I do remember he did this, invocation of himself. And in that he was like very aware of who he was. And then finally that video came out, and it was like so moving because you see him sort of struggling and railing against the sort of thing that he had become, and then sort of accepting that he was a door. He calls himself a door, that like people can pass through, but he's not going to get there, and in his wiser moments or his calmer moments, I think he was okay with that.
I did have one more question. Was everyone across the board like eager to talk about him? Did you have any kind of, was there some kind of nail pulling you had to get with some people to talk about him?
I think it was, there's a lot of, there are people who love him and want to talk about him or feel like he was influenced them and gave them some, like Bob Odenkirk was, I think really wanted to give him his due for the effect that he had on Bob's life. And there were other people, like Holly Wartell did an interview about how, misogynist he was. And we like had that in the cut forever. And then just like ended up like, how far can we push an audience toward like hating someone before they just don't want to, so like, and then it was always important for us to get people, who didn't love him, or even hated him. And it was, and it was interesting. Like, there's a point where George Wendt is like So how real are we being here? Is everyone ratting him out?
That's such a great.
Yeah.
That's in the
Yeah.
trailer even. It's such a great.
Yeah,
moment.
it's such a great moment.
Yeah, and I think I don't know. I like I said, I'm not like in that family, so I'm sure there's even deeper, darker things that exist that are part of that they're gonna.
Well, the reason I just assumed was because like he strikes me as someone that would everyone would love and hate, and even the people who hated him would want to talk about him.
Yeah, like Dave Thomas was happy to like hold forth about like what a what a blowhard he was, but at the same time he gave him total credit for coming up with the idea for SCTV. So, I think a lot of people were, like he had his limits. This is what he was. He wasn't all of these things, but he was this. He did do these, measurably interesting things.
Heather and George, thank you guys for being on the podcast. Dustin, thanks for coming back.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for making the movie. That was good.
Yeah, thanks for making the movie too. It seems like a lot of people have been, like Dustin mentioned, a lot of people have talked about making a movie about this forever.
I think it was good that we came from outside the improv world and could be a little bit separate from the various mafia camps of comedy.
Yeah.
Right.
And there are a million ways to make this movie. I don't know how many, what the number is, but I'd say 150 documentaries that could be made about Del Close. In the same way that, how many ways do you make a Herald? You can just make so many of these things.
That is exactly where my head was going.
Because,
how many ways can you?
Yeah, it's infinite, and his it's hard enough to make a documentary about like a normal person, but like when you get a character like this and all his influence and all his shortcomings and all his magic, there are a million ways to do it.